be giving a talk this morning about data management in general and shipboard practices for data management.
Thanks, Heather. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me all right in the back? Wow, acoustics are good. That's impressive. Matt, we good to go? All right. So I've split this into two parts. The introduction is the first part, sort of some general background on data management concepts and some definitions of terms and to sort of set the context for you. And then the second part, and I did actually split it into two files because they got kind of big. Data management is rather a dry topic, and I know it's not of much interest to most of you, so I put in some pictures and then the files get kind of large. So for the downloads, that should help a little bit. So let's see if this works. So the first part is going to be these sort of general topics, and then the second part will be more about data management specifics. I'm going to start with why this even matters. Why do the course instructors devote an hour and a half to this in a 2-week course where you're very interested in the specifics and the protocols and the techniques of the measurements? Data management has always been part of scientific research. This idea is nothing new, but there are some new aspects to this, and that's what I'll try and highlight in this talk. But I thought this was actually quite fascinating. Here's a slide from 1949. This person is recording on a clipboard, much like this person is doing. So the times have clearly changed here, but we're still doing the same thing. We're still keeping paper logs with pencil on a clipboard on the ship. It's really important to your science. You all know this, but I'm just going to keep repeating this just in case you forget, because it is a lot of work to write it all down. It really, really matters. It's very important. You think you're going to remember things, but you don't. Write it down. Careful and deliberate record keeping. Nothing new there. The results are reported and made available, made publicly available. That might be a little bit different than what it used to be 50 years ago. Certainly it's always been a goal to report it in the peer-reviewed literature. The expectations are shifting somewhat, that the results should be reported sooner, earlier, more completely. And there are some extra caveats to this, and I'll go into those in a little bit more detail in a few more slides. Bottom line, reporting this to enable reproducibility of results. Again, nothing new. That's always been the objective. This I found distressing from the pre-course survey. 57% of you reported having minimal experience with metadata production and data archiving. I would say if that's really true, maybe the question was ambiguous and you misunderstood. If this is true, this is a serious problem for you, for the community. So hopefully we'll try and address this, and you'll have more experience. Next time you answer that question, you'll have more experience with this. Let's start by clarifying what I mean by some of the terms that I'm going to use over the next hour. Data management, when I say data management, it's end-to-end, from the beginning of the proposal all the way to the final archive of the data. Not something that you think about for a brief moment when you write something in your lab book, or not something that you do at the end because someone tells you that it's now a requirement. It's very important to have a plan from the very beginning. And what you're trying to do is ensure that your data and the metadata are recorded accurately, they're preserved, meaning that you have backups. If your plan is that your data are on your laptop and your laptop falls overboard, it happens. That's not a good plan. It's not good for you, it's not good for the community. Very simple things. Again, none of this is very complicated. It's very simple concepts, but if you keep them in mind all the way through your project, it makes a huge difference in your success. And then ultimately, to make your results accessible to others, truly accessible, not just putting them on an FTP site with an Excel file, but really with the complete metadata, well documented, available in a secure location that everyone has access to, publicly, freely available. And what do I mean by a data set? It's fascinating how many different definitions there are for this concept. When I talk about it, this is fairly abstract. It's a logical grouping, somehow, of related measurements that you've decided are related to each other somehow. Quite often, this means that they've come from the same sampling device or collection of sensors, and you feel that they have some relationship to each other. So you've recorded them together, you're reporting them together. That's a data set. This has a lot of different forms. It can be multiple files. One file could be a table on a piece of paper. The idea is that it's a collection of related measurements, and you're going to document them as a collection of related measurements. What do I mean by metadata? This is even more difficult. It's about the data. The problem with this is it's context specific. The definition of it changes depending on who you are and how you're thinking and what you're doing with those data, which makes it problematic when someone like me, a data manager, says, and where are the metadata for these data, for this data set? It's impossible for you to know what I mean. So data managers have to be better at explaining this and giving you guidelines and forms and helping you to record the essential information that's going to sufficiently document your data set. But basically, it's the information required to accurately interpret those data. You've heard a lot about this over the last week and a half. In each of the lectures that talked about the specific measurements that you're making for this type of research, everyone has talked about metadata. And I'll get into some of those specifics too. The data quality, the protocols that you're using, the checks that you've done, and the way you've recorded the quality control measures for those data. But ultimately, it comes down to the information required to support those data to enable accurate interpretation of those data. In general, this is what it is. It's the who, what, where, when, why, how about a data set. But it all comes back to ability to interpret those data accurately. Very important to say who collected it, how they were analyzed, when and where they were acquired, analysis, subsequent processing that was done. That's all captured in your metadata records. There are some changes going on. There are challenges associated with these changes. There's a couple really important aspects of this that make this difficult. These are serious challenges. The data sets used to be a lot smaller. They were published on paper. They were published with the journal article, in the peer-reviewed literature. But they all fit in Table 1. Table 1 might have been a couple of pages, but you had some rows and columns of numbers, and they all fit in there. That's just not true anymore. I think regardless of what kind of data you're collecting, they rarely fit on a piece of paper. They were also published as a tangible thing in a data report, at least a technical report. You could look at them, and the infrastructure existed in labs and libraries for dealing with documenting tangible things. These are pretty significant changes that we're undergoing just over the last couple of decades. We haven't really had time to catch up with this. As the data acquisition has become more automated, as sensors, and there are sensors coming online all the time now, this is good news for scientific research, but it's also a challenge. The rate of acquisition and the volume increases. That's a significant challenge for reporting those data. How do you capture those? How to report them? How do you make them available to your colleagues? The other problem is that while the data acquisition has become automated, the metadata acquisition has not. The sensors rarely self-document themselves, and that information rarely gets carried along with the data, especially these types of data that are often recorded in Excel spreadsheets because it's very convenient to do. The metadata are not in there, and this is a huge problem, that the documentation are not tagged with the data. They get separated or not reported at all. Other changes. This is one of the more interesting things that I've come to realize recently, is that there's a shift going on from a local, what I call local to global, a local focus. This idea that you had a great idea to do research, you got funded, yay. You went to sea, you collected the data, and you published the paper and you're done. And that's the way it used to be done. And these days, the data that you collect are often, the themes are so complicated that you cannot collect these data all by yourself. It absolutely requires a collaborative team. That team is often global. It's not just the person down the hall, it's someone at another institution. Funding agencies are actually looking to fund distributed collaborative teams of researchers. So the research is trending this way, much more complex. The themes, the research themes are more complex, and the teams of people are distributed and much more collaborative than they used to be. So thematically and geographically, we're trending toward more complex research themes and teams of researchers. There are some technological advances that are also enabling these changes. Increases in communication. It enables people to be more distributed and have larger collaborative teams. I used to say that transportation was enabling this too. I don't think that's true anymore. I think transportation has gone backwards, personally. I think it used to be easier to travel, but technology hopefully is enabling us to do Skype or virtual meetings, so we don't actually have to deal with the airline industry as much anymore. There are some cultural changes that need to happen along with those technical changes, and typically cultural changes lag behind the technical changes. This is an opportunity, both an opportunity and a challenge here. One of the most significant aspects of this, I believe, is that there is still no direct relationship between career advancement and publication of data. This is a challenge for data managers, for the community, to encourage people to publish their data, because there are still, the system has not evolved to reward you as scientists for publishing your data, and there are risks in putting your data out there. And I think we're still in the phase where people sense that there are more risks associated with making your data publicly available than there are benefits. I'll give you a couple of examples later. Hopefully we can, as a community, we can try and move toward a place where people are more comfortable and the expectations change to encourage people to publish their data early and make it publicly available. But this is still a huge challenge for the community at large. The cultural changes they're always a work in progress, but the goal should be that the data from scientific research should be made freely accessible to everyone. Achievement of that goal, however, and I alluded to this in the previous slide, is predicated on the fact that anyone using the data must properly acknowledge the data originators. So if you use someone's data, it's very important to know who gets credit for that wonderful collection of data that you were able to find and make use of in your research. And I think often these days, if you make significant use of those data, you should consider co-authorship on that paper. But these are the sorts of things that are still being worked out in the community, and there are no hard and fast rules for this. But the idea is, if those were your data, what would you want the person to do? At least a citation. If you use somebody else's data, even a presentation, it's important to cite the original investigator for those data. Data managers like myself, it's one of the most important pieces of metadata that we collect, is the person who gets credit for making those data available, for contributing them to the data management office. As far as publication of data, so I talked about this a little bit earlier, there's still very little incentive, career-wise, for you to publish your data. I think this is exacerbated by the perception by many people that the data are the property of the originating investigator. This is certainly changing these days, but it's still the case with a lot of people. And that if you make them available, they may be stolen by someone, that you will not receive proper credit for this. This is a community-wide challenge that we all need to cooperate on and try and make some progress. I think this is also true, that the conventional wisdom is that publish or perish applies to journal publications and not data publications. Again, that you're not required to publish your data. This is changing because the funding agencies are shifting now. Certainly in the U.S., I can't speak for other countries, but in the U.S., program managers are beginning to affect change in this area, this idea that you are required to publish your data. Your continued ability to get funding depends on you publishing the data from your previously funded research. So NSF, NASA, and NOAA are all doing this now. Require publication of data generated by federally funded research. You are required in your proposal to address this. In your annual reports and in your final report, you must say how the data have been published or why they haven't been.
Cindy?
Yes, Heather, yeah.
Do you think that, Scott mentioned an open access journal yesterday, Earth System Science Data.
Right.
Do you think that is a step in the right direction?
Absolutely. It's one of the ways that people in the community are trying to address this issue. So the Earth System Science Journal is specifically for publishing data so that it enables you to have a citation for those data. You've recorded in the peer-reviewed literature that these are your data, and it makes it much easier for people to cite them. Along with this is the idea of digital object identifiers. I'm going to try not to get too much into the detailed technical aspects of data management in this talk, but another part of this is this idea of persistent identifiers for digital objects. I alluded to this a little bit before, this idea that when data were published on paper, it was a tangible thing and the infrastructure existed to document that and cite it. Once data become digital, it's a little bit more difficult to document those. And with data sets that are dynamically, so data that the Biological and Chemical Oceanography Data Management Office works with, are being updated and changed all the time by the originating investigator as new calibrations are done or the community cooperates on the quality review of those data, it's very difficult to assign a persistent identifier to something that is so dynamic. So this is a challenge for data managers and computer science people to work out, but that journal is definitely a step in the right direction, and it was created to address exactly that issue, is this realization that the data might be stolen and this idea that you don't get credit for publishing your data. So there are a couple efforts underway to try and address this very thing because the community needs to have access to the data. And so the technology has to try and keep up with this to help with these very real cultural issues where there are hurdles to get over. There's resistance on the part of people, and very understandable resistance to making those data publicly available. So thank you. Yeah, Heather, that's absolutely true. We've done that one. So this policy, this is available, the link to this is available from the course materials site for this course. This is specifically for the US NSF Ocean Sciences Division. This is their data policy. Other funding agencies have similar published data policies. Certainly other countries have them as well. This is just an excerpt, but the basic idea is they're clear about the fact that the metadata in the data must be reported from your funded research. I think the point I'd like to make about this is that when you get your research funding, it is important that you understand the requirements for reporting your data associated with that funding. These days, as I said before, your ability to get continued funding depends on it. So here's one example from the NSF Ocean Sciences. Other funding sources have their own associated requirements. It's important that you understand what they are and have a plan for how you're going to comply with those. There are some new aspects they're getting. The funding agencies, this again is NSF, US NSF, they're getting much more explicit and requesting that you have a plan and document it earlier on in the process, that in your proposal you must state your plan for data management. NSF, well, the funding agencies in general, have realized that one of the most valuable results of the federally funded research are the data that come out of those. And they're being much more strict about requirements for publishing the data from your research. And then this idea of putting it, the annual report, and then certainly your final report, you have to say where the data are published and or why they're not. There are exceptions if the data are not available. Some of the longer, for instance, trace elements and isotope analyses that take longer than 2 years may still be going on, and that can be arranged, or a student thesis is the other common exception to this. If your research funded a student's thesis, then that does not have to be made publicly available until the thesis has been published. So here's this idea of if your feeling is that they're your data, and if someone calls you, you might share them because you have them on your laptop. The idea is that this may be where a lot of people are now, but with time, I'm hoping that, and technology and the cultural changes, that people go from thinking this way more to the understanding that the data belong to the entire community and are valuable to your colleagues, that the data, and we're going to move along this continuum to making the data freely available. Each of these ways of thinking has pros and cons, and it's up to each person to figure out where you are on this line. But hopefully, as a community, we're moving more toward this end of the continuum as we get the infrastructure in place and the culture changes to support this way of thinking. This is related to what I would say is a paradigm shift in this, is that right now, I still think this is the most popular way of getting at data. You know who has the data and you call them. And this is very familiar and it works for you. What I'm hoping is that with time, again, we're going to change, and I promise this is the last time I do this silly little person on the line, that we shift, and data managers, computer science, information technologists will start to develop, and we don't have this yet, a new way of getting access, locating data, downloading the data. But whatever this is has to be easy to learn, convenient, effective. It has to yield better results. It has to yield accurate results. And I would say this is the grand challenge facing data managers in particular, but it will involve contributions from the entire community to try and work toward a better way to support access to these distributed data from the community. And that in turn will encourage people to publish the data. There are new research paradigms that are requiring this. As I said before, the science themes are getting more complicated. They tend to be cross-disciplinary, basin-wide, at least basin-wide, if not global in nature. The other thing that's happening is that the studies are more often involving coupling of complex models. Things that used to be separate research focus, people are now combining them because they realize they have to answer the questions that they find interesting. So atmospheric and hydrologic models are in one study. Or this idea of end-to-end food webs that involve a whole range of disciplines that are involved in this. These research themes require access to data from many, many disciplines. There are new expectations for data access, and I think this is just going to grow with time, having to do with the complex research themes, ocean biogeochemistry, but ocean acidification research as well is cross-disciplinary by nature, and it requires access to data by other researchers. You can't do all of the data collection all by yourself. In addition to that, with the new administration in the US at least, there is suddenly a desire to have science-based decision support. That's somewhat new in this country. Yay. This is a good thing. In addition to the scientific research, the ocean science research, this is going to involve research in the social sciences, economics, history, a broad range of disciplines. This is very interdisciplinary, not just across the disciplines in ocean sciences that this community may be used to, but you're going to be working with colleagues from very, very different disciplines. This has huge ramifications for data access, the ability to use data accurately. And so what do I actually mean when I say access to data? It's not just finding it. It's more than that. It's certainly the ability to locate data of interest to you. But also, do you have access to the information that enables you to answer the question, are these data of use to the research that's of interest to me? It's something that, in the term for this is fitness for purpose, for what you want to use it for. Are these data sufficient for your needs? And then do you have the information that you need to make accurate use of those data? This is the metadata. It should all be captured in the metadata reported with the data. Simple concepts, difficult to support. This requires a lot of work on everyone's part. This is a quotation from a book by Krishna Sinha called Geoinformatics, published in 2006. And I think he did a really nice job capturing all of this, is that there is a significant challenge these days due to the larger volume that I mentioned before, the heterogeneity of these data. This is part of the other issue. It used to be that if you had a large volume of data, they tended to be homogeneous in nature. That's a little easier to deal with. Or if you had very heterogeneous data, chemistry, biology data tend to be, they all fit in a few rows and columns in a spreadsheet because they were so difficult to generate. They weren't automatically generated. These days, I think it's much more likely that you have automated sensors that are generating huge volumes of data regardless of what discipline you're in. And the challenge then is that the integration of those data, heterogeneous, large volumes, becomes extremely difficult to do. And to pull this off, you really want to make this something that computers can do for you, but you have to have machine-readable information to enable that to happen. It's very difficult to sit there with a large Excel spreadsheet and be matching up rows and columns of information cell by cell. If you can put sufficient information in there to enable a computer to help you with that, put it all into MATLAB or ODV, you're ahead of the game. Difficult to do, though. You've got to have that information well documented. There are new expectations and there are new tools based on emerging technologies that will help with this idea of integration of distributed and very heterogeneous data types. I'm not going to go into details on this. As I said before, I think this is beyond the scope of what the course organizers wanted from this portion of the class. But these are three of my favorite topics, and I'm going to try and go to lunch today and also be at the dinner tonight. If you sit at my table, I'd love to talk about this. Okay, from that reaction, if you sit at my table, I promise I won't insist on talking about this. That's usually the reaction I get. These concepts, informatics, semantic mediation frameworks, registered ontologies, have huge potential, I think, for moving the community forward. Perhaps it's just my opinion still at the moment, but I am interested in talking about this if anybody in the audience thinks that's worth a few minutes of discussion. That's all I'll say about that. Did you have a question? Sorry, yes, go ahead.
Explain what those terms mean. I've never heard
just like in a sentence maybe.
I can, thank you. We have our first A. So, informatics. Again, this is a term that people have different definitions because it's not a new field. It's been around for 100 years at least, but I think it's fairly recent that people have started talking about it. And for me, it's the intersection. It usually has something like bioinformatics or ocean informatics associated with it, some qualifier for the domain. But it's the idea that you get information scientists, computer scientists, technology people, and the domain science, so ocean or biology or genomics, involved in the study of the way you use technology to enable people to relate more effectively to the information that's of interest to them. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's a very broad field. It involves lots of different areas of expertise, and the idea is that it enables us to do science in a better way, I think. It enables us to use technologies more effectively. The semantic mediation, semantics having to do with the meaning of words. So the mediation means that you have some help. The idea is that you have a bunch of information, resources. These days you think about it on the web. That's where a lot of people are going to get their information. So Tim Berners-Lee, this is his idea really of Web 2.0. So the first web, you had lots of HTML pages distributed everywhere, and it was good. And it was easy to do, and people put information all over the web. And then what happened was that it was information overload. It was difficult to figure out what all of that meant to you, and when you got the Google hit list back, which of these 40,000 things might be useful to me. The idea of semantic mediation, and so I'll skip right into the science application of this, is that if you found 100 data sets that match some criteria that you put in, if you have semantic mediation and think about it as a layer, you've got lots of data resources usually presented at the bottom layer when you see a picture of this kind of thing, and then you're up at the top wanting to get at that information. If you had a layer in the middle that could more effectively respond to the query that you issued, saying, are there any data available anywhere? I'm interested in PCO2 data from the Arabian Sea from 1995. Without the metadata and a translation of what those metadata mean to your query, so someone reporting the metadata might not have called it PCO2, they might have called it something else, but you're calling it PCO2. How does the data source respond to your query to say, yes, I have data of interest to you? That's the semantics translating, and it uses this idea of registered ontologies, and I'll explain what that is, to translate what's available to match it up with what you've asked for. And that semantics, translating the words, translating the vocabulary, your vocabulary to the vocabulary associated with the resources. Does that help? Okay. And then this registered ontologies, so that's two parts. An ontology has to do, bless you, ontology has to do with controlled vocabularies, lists of terms that have definitions, and then on top of that, an ontology means that you also encode the meaning of those words with the definitions and often the relationship of those terms with other terms. So the ontology is an encoding, it's a framework for, bottom line, it's a framework for encoding knowledge. So instead of saying, I have nitrate data, I might also say that nitrate data is a nutrient. And I might also be able to say that in particular these nitrate data came from an automated sensor on a CTD package, not done in a lab by this type of analysis. And so that ontology is going to capture all of that knowledge about those nitrate data. And having done that, then I put on top of that this semantic mediation layer that knows what to do with all of that information, so that when you ask for nitrate data from the North Atlantic during the spring bloom, my data system knows how to give that back to you. Does that good? Does that help?
So it's the Google search but for data.
Sorry?
It's like the way Google does searches but for data.
Amazon.com does this really well. Yeah. If you like this book, you might also like this. They're doing that with semantic mediation. And a lot of the progress in this is being made in pharmaceutical industry is using this very effectively. Commercial retailers, Amazon.com, Google has some very intelligent search algorithms, but they're based on the use of the metadata and these registered ontologies that are documented. So none of those fancy search algorithms work unless someone has done a lot of work to put that, to tag the information, the original information with the metadata. Yes?
What is the ontology for marine data?
There are some groups working on this. So in the EU, an organization called CDataNet has gotten representatives from lots of countries together, and it's being driven, those activities are being, and in the US it's the Marine Metadata Initiative, MMI, is working on this to try and document ontologies for marine data. So the Marine Metadata Initiative is starting with metadata, terms, documentation for terms associated with geospatial data, latitude, longitude, temporal data. It's rare that an organization gets down to what I call the column level or the parameter names. That's when it gets very difficult to try and document what chlorophyll A is. That gets harder. There are organizations that are doing this, but the answer, unfortunately, is that it doesn't exist yet. So there are no ontologies for marine data. There are some general ontologies. SWEET, S-W-E-E-T, is probably the most well-known one for things like units is one of the things they have in there, units of measurement, but that's an important one for science as well. And then a lot of the social networking implementations use things like FOF, friend of a friend. There are ontologies for describing people and people's relationships to other people. So things like Facebook or MySpace use those. Yes?
Just for clarification, is a registered ontology living at the data level, or does it live at the search engine level?
Right, thank you. I didn't say what the registered part was. I went to the ontology after saying there were two parts. So the idea of a registered ontology is that not only have you developed this, it can be a file at that point of encoded knowledge about some terms that you know something about, you've also registered it. It can be registered at the local data site. What's more valuable is if it's registered, there's something called the Open Ontology Registry now that is developing I want to say that's a U.S. thing, but it may be international. And the more international these things are, the better. If it's community-wide, great. If it's international, even better, that you have large groups of people contributing to the development of these things and also adopting the use of them. So the idea of it being registered is that it is available for other people, publicly available for other people to use if they'd like to use it to document their data resource. Or at least if I make data available, I say, these pigment data use terms, and when I say chlorophyll A, it uses the definition that you can find in this registered ontology at this publicly available source. Yes?
There's for the biologists who are interested, there's a gene ontology database which categorizes genes according to function so that you're not, wandering around trying to figure out what AP24 does. You can look at gene ontology and they'll tell you, what it and related genes do according to a certain category, like, metabolism or, ion transport.
And is that available from the genome databases, from the Genome Project?
It's online. It's separate from something like GenBank,
Mm-hmm.
but the idea is GenBank returns you the name of the gene, but it doesn't necessarily return you a good descriptor of what it does, because people may categorize things different according to their interest in the gene. And so the gene ontology database kind of filters through and makes that standardized so that you can sort of standardize what your description of the gene does.
Okay. Thank you.
It's an example.
And it's a great example. There are other communities that are developing these ontologies all the time. So, and as you can imagine, something like this that takes you from the gene itself to the functionality that gene is performing in the ecosystem, that makes all the difference to your being able to interpret that in your research focus. Okay, thank you. Just go ahead and ask questions as they come up. I should have said that earlier, but thank you for helping me clarify this. So, data access. All of those new technologies, the informatics, the semantic frameworks, are predicated on the assumption that the data resources are accompanied by machine-readable data. This just isn't the case yet. If I get metadata associated with the data, I'm happy. And I'm working as a data manager. I and other data managers are working to make the metadata more machine-readable, to format things in a more standard way, using standards, content standards, to share these and document this. But we're not there yet. We're moving along as quickly as we can, but this is all changing quite rapidly. So while we wait for these new informatics tools to come online and really be production ready, they're still in the research phase at the moment. Ocean science data accompanied by human readable metadata are still of great value. So we'll start there. Let's get the metadata in with these data sets, and we'll work on the machine readable and the information science part of it next. For example, here's a data set that came into our office last year. This was the entire data set, so I haven't just hidden the other parts. This was in an Excel spreadsheet, and this is the entire thing. In my opinion, these are incomplete. This is an incomplete data set, and they're really of very little use to anyone. If you were relying on this colleague to report the nutrient data for your project, you've got a problem. Presumably, the originator can use this sample ID, I think it is, as a proxy for where and when these measurements were made. And maybe it's millimolar for units. It's not clear. But this is a problem. There were no metadata, and I have yet to receive any metadata for these. And I don't think they're of much use. I did not credit the originator of these data. I think if it was a good example, I certainly would have, but I didn't in this case. And I looked up to make sure that the person who contributed these was not in this class. So we're almost at the end here of this intro part. As we go from this idea of local measurements having a global context and being used for global interpretation, and we switch from the old ways of doing things to the new ways, there are challenges associated with all of this, and that can be frustrating. There are also real opportunities here to do science in a new way, to do it in a better way, maybe more efficiently, to have the capability of answering much more complex questions. So as difficult as this transition might be, as frustrating as it is sometimes, there are some real opportunities here. And I think it's pretty exciting. Could just be me. I also think semantics is exciting. I love metadata. I'll leave you, so this is the end of the first part of this, with this quote. This is Peter Wiebe, who's a researcher here at WHOI. When I was talking to him about data management, saying, how do I motivate people to get excited about metadata? And he said, well, you can't play with the data without the metadata. And then he paused for a minute and he smiled and he said, well, you can, but it's much less fun. And I think this is one of the most important points. Yes, it's a lot of work and nobody likes to spend time doing it, and it's often thought about at the end when you're out of money and you're on to doing the next exciting piece of research. But without the metadata, the data really aren't as much fun. I may still have to do some selling on that point, but this was Peter Wiebe that said this. It wasn't me. This was his response when I said this. Yes, yeah.
One of the things that concerns me about sort of the information, making so much information publicly available, is that if any one of us, after learning so much about proper analysis of carbonate chemistry, for example, wanted to look at a data set that was publicly available, we would know that we would need to go to the metadata, and we would need to see how the analyses were done, and we would need to see what reference standards they were used, and so on and so forth. But my students certainly wouldn't. And so a part of the thing that is missing here is that there's so much information that is available now to students who don't have an effective filter for what is good information and what is bad information, and how by increasing the amount of information that's out there and requiring this additional step of having to go through the metadata and understand it and interpret it, how then do we get our students to be effective at understanding these data when even a lot of researchers are too lazy to go into the metadata?
So this is a really good point, and it goes all up and down the line, not just with students, but as the data become more available and people would like to use them for science-based decision support, I think that becomes an even more serious problem, that legislation is based on an incorrect use of the information. This is part of the cultural change. There's no quick fix for this. Education is the answer. It's absolutely in your hands, in all of our hands, to educate people. I mean, you can go to the pharmacy now and self-medicate. It's not necessarily a good idea. I mean, this is right? This is everywhere in the culture. Right? It's all up and down. So it's just that perhaps this is new in this community, because as more information becomes available, it's like this with anything on the web, that you have ready access to information, and you have a responsibility to think, to use your brain, to think, just because I can get these rows and columns of numbers. But you're absolutely right that, as the technology gets more powerful and we have the ability to combine this data set and this one and put all the columns together that were called PCO2, whatever that means.
But I guess in the past, if a student wanted the data, they needed to go to the PI or somebody in the PI's program and say, I'm really interested in these data, which gives that person an opportunity for a teachable moment where they can say, okay, here are the data, but we need to understand this in the context of how the measurements were done. And that is lost in this paradigm.
Right. Balanced against, okay, fair point. Balanced against, one of the things I like about this new paradigm, and it's certainly not without pitfalls, is that it helps to level the playing field, so that now not just students at Andrew Dixon's lab have access to Andrew Dixon's quality data. Hopefully everyone in the world has access to those data. That's a good thing. And we get all of the best minds working on this. But you're absolutely right. We can't leave the part out where people have to be trained. And I think it just means that training has to come earlier as part of the educational process, as part of the learning how to be a researcher in this field is that, I mean, when data are downloaded from BecoDemo, the metadata come with them. And there's a note with it that says, be sure to read the documentation with these. And as much information as we've been able to collect from the contributing investigator, that all that information is available, and hopefully with citable references where you can read the rest. And the data originator's name. And as I say, I think if you're thinking of making significant use of these data, it is incumbent upon you to contact that researcher and say, I'm going to be using the data, anything you want to, I mean, if I were doing it, I would. Anything you want to tell me about this, have you updated them? I got the data from 2005. And it looks like, you know, I'm seeing correlations between what you have and what I have, and I'd like to talk about co-authoring a paper. This is part of one of the other advantages I see, is that instead of people stealing your data, there are opportunities for new publications, new ways of interpreting the data and using those data, correlating them with even other fields of research, and that you ultimately get more publications out of it rather than having the opportunity stolen. Yes, yeah.
Do you see this happening as more formalized training for students? I mean, is this getting integrated into the courses already being taught, or are independent courses on data management becoming more and more common?
Well, I would say it's been integrated here, right?
Right.
Right. And we talked about this at the beginning of the course, that each of the course instructors would address data quality, data management for their specific measurement. So it is educators are asking these questions. Yes, it is happening. There are courses on data management informatics being taught as part of, I don't know that it's required yet by any program, but they certainly are becoming available. This is all very new. You know, as the technology, as I said before, the technology usually moves faster than the cultural changes. So the cultural changes, education process, the infrastructure required, the infrastructure meaning the social infrastructure as well, to support these new ways of doing research is coming along, is being developed. But transitions are hard. This is tough. We're going to have to think about this and do it in a very thoughtful way as we move from the old way of doing things to the new. Challenges and opportunities here. But absolutely, it has to be integrated into the training process as students are being trained that metadata are important. You must record it, you must share it, and you must use it. You must require it, you must look for it yourself when you're using the data, and know how to interpret the information that you find. Yes?
It seems like the underlying assumption here is that people are trying to get data and use it in mutually beneficial ways to learn knowledge collectively and do, have a very, they're on the same page, they're trying to get the same place. There are very antagonistic things going on here too. Maybe, and that causes some serious problems. Maybe you could address that.
Let me answer what I think you're pointing out here. So I think what you're saying is, for something like iron synthesis research, there are potentials for economic gain, there are potentials for legislation, and there is a fear that the data related to that field of research, ocean acidification, I would say, is the same situation, will be used improperly, incorrectly. And the way I counter that is the alternative to not have the information available, I think, is worse. Was that the point you were making, or did I misunderstand? Yes.
Our group has been working with petroleum hydrocarbons, and so the state and federal agencies are going one direction, and the industry is going diametrically opposing direction.
Right.
And it causes serious problems where you suddenly find your data being used inappropriately to explain why things aren't that way. So there are issues.
Yeah, this is a huge challenge. So an industry like that, where the industry data are often proprietary as well, so it's not an equal. There's not an exchange of free exchange of information. Yeah, I don't have the good answer for that. I would fall back on the alternative of not having any information available is worse. Just like in a repressed society, I think you make the information available, you communicate it, and you do it often and early and loudly. And when you find improper use of that information, you speak up. I used to do research in the hydrocarbon field, so I know the perils of this. This is, I mean, people's careers are ruined by this. They're blackballed, and this is incumbent upon the federal research agencies to support people in this as well, and they haven't always had a good track record on this. I mean, our most recent administration is a prime example of this sort of thing. And so there are ups and downs as you work through this. There's not a safe answer for this. I think you do the best you can, and I believe, and maybe I'm a bit Pollyanna about this, I do believe the alternative was worse, and the answer is to make the information available. You put the truth out there, and maybe it becomes a convenient truth at some point. And yeah, yes, yeah.
Yeah, a couple of points. One, it's always important to realize that data is not science, and that within the federal agencies, they seem to equate the two. And that if I got huge quantities of data feeding into a fire hose, that I'm somehow providing science-based decisions to be made. And those decisions are based on the science, which requires a cognitive engagement of the data. And the pace at which we're feeding this fire hose within these agencies sometimes, I think, becomes to a point where it's detracting from those of us trying to actually do that cognitive engagement of the data set. We want to make sure that when the data goes out, he's indicating that the interpretation behind the data is paramount.
Right.
Paramount. And that the data is important, but it is not as important as the science which involves that data is actually generated. The decisions that are made, the policy decisions that are made should be based on that full enterprise of science, and the data is but only one aspect of it. And so, and the other point I wanted to make is we've seen throughout the past week or so some great utilities for pulling off these enormous data sets, and it's very efficient. And there seems to be less work on the front end of that, on our side of actually. So I'm running into this now where we're trying to devise strategies within NOAA as to well, what do we do with all this data, how do we feed it all up, and the problem is there's too many options to go. We don't know, what is the better option? What is the most efficient mechanism to actually get it to that so that people can pull it off? There seems to be more training in how to pull the data off than how to upload the data and stuff.
Well, it's a work in progress. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. We're in transition. This is very difficult, very challenging, and transitions are hard. We don't know yet. This is still research being done on this. The informatics, semantics. There's still a lot of research to be done on how best to do this. In the meantime, as I said before, I think the most important point is record the metadata and make the data available, and we'll get better at this as time goes on. Unfortunately, that's about all I can offer you at the moment. We don't have the answers. We're working on this. NOAA's making a lot of progress, actually. I would say that's a great example of the way the funding agencies are really helping to enable this and putting some real dollars behind this effort to investigate better ways to do this, better ways to make use of metadata content standards.
Our problem is we've got multiple different programs across NOAA that are simultaneously pinging us from different directions, having us feed the same data in multiple databases. And at the end of the day, we're left saying, well, these databases, but maybe we should all get together on this.
And so it's important that you get that feedback back to the people that are saying, woohoo, now we can do all this, let's everybody contribute to all 6 places at once, and that's not the right answer. You should have to contribute at once. And then the data centers should work out how that information gets propagated around. Yeah. Let me go, because the second part of this is actually longer than the first part, so I'm going to have to go through this really fast. Let's see. Little bit. Well,
We've done it before.
I know better than to take coffee break time to talk about metadata. That's just, any progress I've made will be squandered as soon as I do that, so that's not to be done. This talk will be on the web. You can get the information. I'll go through this, but I tried to put as much of the information actually in the slides, so not having me babble at you about metadata. So I'll try and go through this, because we want to try and finish at about 10, right? Is that right, the coffee break? Okay. Ideally, she said.
Well, but I mean, we've run over so many times already that this wouldn't be the first.
Yes, but it was how to do PCO2, not Metadata are fun. So here we go with the second part of this. Well, you're still laughing anyway. I'm going to split this one into two parts. The first part, I'm going to talk about things having to do with research cruises, and then the second part, more specifically on data and metadata reporting. So keep the general comments that we did in the first part in mind as the motivation, as the justification, as the reason why we would care to do all of this work, the reason why I think this is important for us as a community to do. But of course, a lot of you are saying right now, but I don't go to sea. I do experiments or mesocosms or perturbation experiments. Everything I say certainly applies to experiments as well. It's just that when you go to sea, there are extreme conditions sometimes. So all of this becomes even more important, and you're more likely to have multiple researchers on board dealing with these conditions. So everything I say certainly applies to all of the ways that you might do the research. I'm going to start by saying that when I put this talk together, what I tried to do was cover things that are not covered in this report. This is an excellent report. It is also available from the resources site. If you haven't already downloaded it, you really should. This is very well done. And it's still being developed, so the content will change. It will be updated as more information is available. This is absolutely worth reading, and I think I mention it again because I think it's so valuable. And so the things that what is missing from this are the things specifically about recommendations that I would make for doing shipboard data management. And so it's meant to be a complement to this report, although there's a lot of overlap because there are just some basic ideas that can't be talked about too many times. All right, so let's start with the cruise stuff. It starts before the cruise. You have a plan of your sampling regime, your station plan, and this can be quite complex depending on the type of research that you're doing. Allocation of wire time. One of the things about cruises is that every time you turn around, it's something else that's limited. You only have so much wire time available. And you only have so much water that's coming up in those sampling devices. So this is really important to do this ahead of time. Figure out how you're going to get all of the sample water you need to do all of the analyses that are required for your research topic. They should be made prior to the cruise and then reviewed at the first science briefing on board. Bottom line, have a plan. Write it down. Communicate it, share it often. Make sure everyone understands. This photo is an homage to Betty Bunce, who taught a lot of scientists how to do, I bet most people in this audience are too young to know her, but she taught a lot of scientists how to do a pre-cruise briefing. She was one of the best. So here's an example of a CAST plan. This is Excel. Again, no fancy applications required here. I don't know if you can see this, but it's got multiple sheets. There must have been 20 sheets from this. This was from one cruise. 20 different types of casts that were done to enable them to sample the different depths that they needed in the different types. They had both trace metal and a CTD Niskin rosette on board. And this is just one of these sheets where they broke down at each depth the type of analysis. Here you can see this was a cruise that was doing the type of research that you're doing. And then all the way out here you can't see because it was so far. The final column is a total of, and these are milliliters of water from the sample bottle, the total water to make sure that it didn't add up to the maximum that was available from that sampling device. And they had macros in this so that they could tweak numbers and figure out how to make the numbers come out. This was done well in advance of the cruise, tweaked at the pre-cruise meeting, adjusted during the cruise to figure out how to get all of the samples they needed. Pretty simple idea, but incredibly powerful to make sure you cover all the analyses that you need. Metadata, it's all about keeping records. And again, this guy with the clipboard from the mid-1900s, log sheets in various forms. It's just a more formal way to record this is metadata. Cruise report, that's your cruise metadata. Data inventory, it's a list of your data set metadata. And then an event log, and I'll talk about these in detail. That's the metadata records for the devices that you deployed during the cruise. Here's an example. This is probably one of the most familiar. People that have gone to sea have used these. These have been around for a long time, since I used to go to sea. This is a standard CTD rosette cast. Again, you've got all of the different, you probably can't read these, but TOC, TIC, you've got HPLC, chlorophyll, pigment measurements, sample IDs here, depths, target depths, nominal depths where the bottle was fired, maybe some comments. Actually, this is nitrate out here. There's no comments on this one about, stopcocks getting malfunctioning and things like that. That's a basic log sheet for recording your information. There's a general idea of a cruise report. Some people do these, some don't. I believe this is a really effective way to document what happened on a cruise. And some of the basic pieces of this, you've got your basic cruise metadata. This cruise ID turns out to be a really valuable concept. Very simple, but a unique way to identify that cruise so that when you're talking about it in the publication, you can refer to that cruise in a way that other people will recognize it. And they can also find information about this cruise because this is the official identifier for the cruise. Everyone also always has their pet name for the cruise, or they identify it by the chief scientist's name. Well, you do. And that's great too, and you should document that as well, but link it to this official cruise ID so that databases that use this as the relational field in a relational database can help you integrate those discrete data sets from that cruise. A list of who was on board, what their role was, what they were doing when they were on board. Write it down, add the list to the cruise report. A data inventory. Who was expecting to collect what data, and then update it at the end of the cruise so you know what data were actually collected. It helps give you a list so that you know when you've got everything at the end. Very simple idea, but just list after list after list. And then an event log, a list of all of the device deployments. There is also a guide. I think this was available from the resources site as well, but if not, here's the link. You can find the PDF. This is a best practices guide that was developed after supporting the U.S. GLOBEC and the U.S. JGOF's research programs, recommendations for doing cruise documentation in a better way, the things that were really important to that type of research. Here's an example from a cruise of a data inventory. This was a pretty standard biogeochemistry cruise. So who collected what data from what devices? Pretty simple list. You can certainly add more information to that, but boy, this would get you a long way to knowing what was done on the cruise and whether you had it all at the end. So a sample event log, this is one of my favorite things to really enable people to make good use of data that are coming off of research cruises. It's a chronological record of all of the sampling events that happened during a cruise, and each sampling event is assigned a unique identifier. No standard way of doing this. You can make up your own depending on your research, but there are lots of examples out there of people that have done this before. These are becoming pretty standard procedure on biogeochemistry cruises where you have a complex array of sampling being done, different people, different devices. It enables you to integrate those observations from all of the different sampling devices more easily, and also to understand the relative timing of events. That the Mach Ness tow, the fifth Mach Ness tow was done between CTD stations 10 and 11. Very easy to see that if you have a chronological record of the events that were done. Here's a sampling event matrix from a Vertigo cruise. This was Ken Bissler's cruise in the Pacific from a couple of years ago. You can't read this, but the idea is that you've got each of these colors is a different sampling device, and each column is a different day from hour 1 through hour 22. Very complicated sampling program. If you have an event log that goes with this, all of these different sampling devices, much easier to figure out the relative position and which type of sampling was done. Why is it important? It helps to integrate the observations. Here's an example. If you have a CTD station and cast and it's assigned a unique number, here's an example. You can make up whatever you like, but it should be unique within that cruise. Then the nutrient data from a Niskin bottle from this sampling event can be more easily integrated with the pigment data. So there's an example, but put in your favorite data type in there, and it's more easily to do because you know which station and cast that came from. People call that station and cast different things. Somebody else might have their own numbering system, but if you all reference the same event number, it makes it easier to know you've got the same sampling. Someone who only samples from the odd number stations might number them 1 through 10, but not the same numbering that you use. I see this all the time on cruises, and it can cause huge confusion. What are the important fields in here? The sample event identifier. There's a couple examples of ways to do this. Most often it includes some sort of date and time or sequential numbering system. Station and cast, date and time, UTC, please. Position, latitude, and longitude. You'd be amazed at how many times people don't report this. It's really important to know where on the planet those data came from. Other important fields, the package. People are deploying penguins these days, so you put the sensor on the bird and you let it go. Put that in your event log. The name of the person, so you know who to contact if you have a question about that event, and what sort of activity this was associated with the event. Did you throw the CTD over the side? Did you get it back? Nice to have those match up in the event log. And then some other things, and again, those first few I listed, I would say those are highly recommended, even required, when and where and who, what. But there's some other things, depending on the type of work that you're doing. I've often seen people keep detailed notes in a logbook, and they reference the log page associated with that event in the log. This can be incredibly useful to people. If you've got the type of sampling events that require stories associated with them, then you can reference that, or relative to some feature that has some relationship to the research that you're doing. Here's an example of an event log from a cruise in the Southern Ocean. So you can see here the column headers, the types of information that I was recommending. This event number is generated by some algorithm. This one is based on a year day, the 21st day of the year, and then a time. And so they ensured that those ended up being unique. Some other columns, the date and time information came from the shipboard system. And then the last few columns here came from a controlled vocabulary where they agreed on the way that they were going to identify these activities, and then they use last names. Sometimes you have to use first initial, last name, making sure that you know who this person is that you contact for information about that event. One of the really important things to do is agree on the data sources for your event log. So at Betty Bunce's science meeting, they would agree on where they were getting that position from. Does it absolutely have to come from the bridge log? And in the olden days, you didn't have that many events, and you could get it from the bridge log where the crew were logging equipment going over the side. These days, it's more likely that you're going to have some sort of readout from a shipboard network in the main lab, and that's where you get the information. So date and time, but not from your watch. That's not the time that event started, or it's not the ship's clock. But agree. The point is agree. Everyone needs to know where this common source is coming from for time and position. And also agree on the required position. Do you need 4 decimal places in the position for your information? I would encourage you to do maybe 1 or 2 more than you think you need, because again, this idea of local and global, for you it might be good enough to get 1 decimal place, but probably 4 is better in decimal degrees. So the final event log that you generate should be an electronic file, tab or comma-separated values. However, most people these days are still recording these events on paper. You have paper logs. The downside of that is that you have maybe multiple paper logs or 1 paper log in the main lab, and if you've got a large vessel, you've got people working all over the ships in different vans. So ultimately what happens is chief scientists will usually identify 1 person, the most obsessive compulsive person on board who has something to gain from this event log being kept accurately, is in charge of entering those events from the paper into the Excel spreadsheet and verifying the quality of those. If you do keep them on paper, it's really valuable to scan those. And in the BICO-DEMO, the Biological Chemical Oceanography system, we actually put those online as an original data source. So if there's a question about the event, you can go to that original source and see the original entry in the log and see whether someone just transcribed it incorrectly or whether there's some information to be gained. So this is, again, a very simple thing to do, but quite powerful. Not to mention the fact that it gives you a backup of those paper logs if they get lost on the way home. Some research vessels actually have event logging applications, software applications that can help you do this in a more automated way. There is a new project funded by NSF Ocean Sciences to develop an event logger application. It's called the R2R project, Rolling Deck to Repository, to develop an application to pull information as much as possible off the shipboard network system and to try and automate the entries in the event log to make it easier to keep these records. So you put all those pieces together and you put your cruise report together in a document, Word, maybe converted to PDF, that's great. And then you share that with people at the end of the cruise. So that pretty much covers the first part of that. And now we'll switch to doing some specifics about data quality, some general sort of summary about metadata, and then just a little bit about reporting your data to the national data centers. I'm going to try and summarize the data quality. You got very specific information about data quality as it pertains to the measurements that you're making in those individual lectures from the people that know about this, and so I'm not going to add to that. But I will, I think I'm paraphrasing Andrew Dixon from his lecture last week, but essentially he said it was important to have a system in place to assure outside users that the analytical results produced are of proven and known quality. This is really the whole point right here. No surprising that Andrew Dixon is the one who told us this, but this is a very important concept. In addition to that, Krishna Sinha, again from Virginia Tech, has said that when you assess the quality, you have to keep in mind the time that the data were collected, the methodology, the capability of the time, so that when data are reported from the mid-'80s, using the best technology available and the protocols considered the best at the time, you have to keep that in mind. Those were the measurements that were the best that people were able to do at that time. And keep that in mind when you do this fitness for purpose assessment that you have to do when you're looking for data, other people's data. Data quality, in my opinion, has two aspects to it: the quality assurance and the quality control. I separate these two out by thinking about the quality assurance is what you do before you make the measurement, and quality control is what you do after you have the measurement. This is not a widely accepted definition of this. This is the way I try and sort this out in my own mind when I talk to people. And so obviously the measurement itself is somewhere in the middle of those two. It involves both aspects of this. But altogether, the quality assessment involves both of those pieces. The full quality assessment involves both of those aspects. It's very important to understand that when you're reporting on the quality of a data set, of a set of measurements, it's not a statement of the value of those data to the community. It's recording additional, really important information about that data set. It's up to the researcher to decide fitness for purpose. I think this is one of the reasons a lot of people don't report this information, is because they feel somehow, because their research wasn't funded at a level to enable them to do the latest and greatest and most expensive analyses. Fine, that's just the reality of this kind of work. You do the best you can, you assess the technology for your fitness for purpose, for the research that you are funded to do, and you do the best you can, and you report that information with the data. Just because the data set may be ranked lower on some scale used to assess the quality does not mean it's of less value. However, if you don't know the quality assessment associated with the data set, that data set is of less value. If you have no idea what protocols were followed, what efforts were made to assure the quality or do quality control, that data set is of much less value. This is the point that you were making earlier, a part of that point of what are these data, where did they come from, and what was done to ensure the quality. So basically the metadata, you're trying to capture these questions and the answers to those questions. And this is related to the accuracy and precision discussion that happened last week as well. You're documenting that as part of your quality as well. And I believe these were Andrew Dixon's phrases as well. Quality assurance, how good do I need this measurement to be? And quality control, how'd I do? How good did I get it? Pretty simple idea here. The metadata captures those questions and the answers to them. So the interesting thing is that a lot of this information still fits in the methods section of your paper. The problem is that the data don't fit there. They don't fit in Table 1 anymore. The implication, the significance of that problem is that the information required to document, this data assessment process doesn't appear with the data. So some of the metadata show up in the paper, and the data maybe get published in a database, and the metadata don't always follow along with the data. And this is a huge challenge these days. So this is something that we really need to correct. It used to be that the data and the metadata ended up in the paper. And now we're in this awkward phase where we're not quite sure how to do this now. So I love this part of Andrew Dixon's lecture the other day, where he was talking about your ability to assess fitness for purpose. This concept is really the basis for a lot of the metadata reporting. You need to know why the measurement was made. Knowing this helps your ability to ascertain, are these data good enough? And it is related to the uncertainty, your ability to answer this question, are these data good enough for my purposes, fitness for purpose, has to do with the uncertainties associated with that measurement. You need the full report of that metadata, the quality assessment metadata. And this is your decision. You have to define this, what you're willing to accept for your research. What's an acceptable level here? In general, metadata are used for all of these things. The ability to locate the data, to determine fitness for purpose. The data quality is especially important for this aspect. And then to facilitate the accurate interpretation of those data. And this comes to that point that was made earlier too. If you lose all of that information and really the knowledge that are associated with those data, that becomes a problem. It's expensive to do this. It takes people's time. Sometimes it requires an expert in this to help you do this. However, I would also say that the benefits are substantial from doing this recording, in that it helps people find the data set and use them effectively, accurately, and it enables the full benefit of the investment in those data to be realized. These ocean science data in particular are incredibly expensive to get, and you can't go back and get them again. That's, the day you were out there, at the moment you threw that instrument over the side, those are the measurements that were made. Just one little comment about, all the hoopla about metadata is talking about it in this way, and actually having somebody stand up here for over an hour and talk to you about metadata is a fairly recent thing. It's interesting. It started actually, it wasn't that long ago in the U.S. It was driven by, in the U.S. anyway, it was driven by a couple of acts of Congress, this Paperwork Reduction Act, and combined with the development of the internet and the World Wide Web, well, actually HTML coming in, not just the internet, but HTML giving us the World Wide Web, the ability, the possibility that information was available, and then there was another act that required government documents to be publicly available online, and that was an incredible amount of work for people to do with just HTML pages and static pages and the web, and so people had to start tagging documents, digital objects with information, with metadata, and that's really where this came from. One of the first ones was the Dublin Core Initiative. I'm not going to go into any of these standards, but this was one of the early attempts at defining sort of the minimal amount of metadata information that was available to document a digital object. There's no cookbook for this. We're still figuring this out. We're all still trying to figure this out. What is the essential information? You could ask for everything. I mean, some of the FGDC records are pages and pages and pages of information, and I think part of the frustration as a researcher, you look at this and you go, I just don't even see where this is ever going to be used, and it takes your time to fill it out and even find that information to fill in that field. So one of the objectives is to figure out what's the minimum of information that's really required to document these data sets, and see if we can get that, and anything else that we can automate or people are willing to give us, great, but let's try and get the minimum of information online. we're starting to develop the best practices, or at least better practices, and this is an iterative process. As the research themes become more complex, the costs are going to continue to increase. And this idea that these in situ data, you have one chance to do this. Those data from last March that was Tahiti. No, north of that, Hawaii. Oh, that's the hot site, actually. Once you have them, you can't go back and get them. This is the Hawaii Ocean Time Series. Time Series, you had one shot to get that in that sequence of data. It's important to document what you measure. So I feel like I'm going ad nauseum about this. So here, I guess this is a little bit more specific. Again, for ocean acidification research, here's some of the specific aspects of this. The objective of which is to report sufficient metadata to support this fitness for purpose question process that you go through, and to enable accurate use of the data. And you've heard about these things in all of the individual lectures over the past week and a half for the specific types of analyses and measurements that you're making. Important to document all of this. This is especially important for this kind of research where the protocols are still being established. One of the types of research that you're being funded to do is to develop better techniques all the time. It becomes even more important to document the techniques that are used. If you're not using a previously established protocol that's documented and you cite that reference, it's important to say how you did do these measurements. And then also this idea of local versus global, both in space and in time, that your locally collected data may have global implications, but also in time, that data collected from the mid-1900s are still of great value to the community as long as they have sufficient metadata documenting them. So good, I'm going to mention it again. This IPOCA report is a really great effort at documenting better practices right now for data management, and very specifically for ocean acidification research. If you haven't looked at this, you really need to download this document. It's very well done, and it will continue to be updated by this group of people that are getting the contributions from the set of authors. So this is difficult. When you do this at sea, because of where you are and what's going on, I guarantee you that this person is not thinking about writing down the metadata, and at the moment that this kind of thing happens, the wave crashes over the starboard side. This person crouching, I think they were climbing actually up on the CTD frame. People are not thinking about metadata, so it just means you need to keep this in mind when you can. You do the best you can to document everything because these data are expensive and you have one shot at it. So just to remind you of where we are when we're talking about this, and data managers understand this is not an easy process, but they do matter. It's going to be expensive. This idea of it's expensive in people as well. Equipment, often you have one of these instruments that's available. You've got it out there for the month that you're at sea. Very expensive in many ways to do this kind of research. It's complicated because you have lots of people involved, and the answers, the data collected by this research are very, very important. So all that means it just matters even more than it ever did. It's always been important. It just matters even more now. I'm just going to quickly talk about, so we're almost at the end here. Thank you for hanging in there. There are a few organizations that are available to help you with this process. So BICO-DEMO, the one that I work with, specifically for researchers funded by U.S. NSF Ocean Sciences. If your funding comes from that source, it will probably be suggested that you contact us to help you with the data management. We're available to work with you all the way through proposal, all the way through preservation. I'm not going to talk in great detail because this applies to less than half of you in the class, but just to say that in your particular situation, your funding agency probably has identified an organization that will work with you. Regardless of the funding source or the country that you're in, there are organizations that have been funded or at least exist, maybe not funded yet, but they exist, and the expectation is that they'll work with investigators in those countries to help get the data online. A little bit about standards, although bottom line is right now a lot of the effort dealing with metadata standards, standards for information, are being handled by the larger data centers, and which in a way I think is a good thing at the moment. It relieves a lot of the pressure off of you to deal with this, because it is still changing and we're still trying to figure out how best to deal with this. I will say, though, that as we move toward community-adopted standards for this, and here I'm talking about standards in a very general way, the sampling and the analytical protocols, as the community starts to agree on the best ways of doing this and it moves out of the research phase and into documented protocols for this, that's an advantage. Makes it easier to report the metadata. All you have to say is that I followed the protocol documented in this paper, in this reference. It becomes a lot easier. Same thing with metadata content standards. All you say is that these metadata are compliant with FGD standard or the ISO standards, more international ones. It's possible that these are required by the data centers, but there's a lot of variation in this. It depends on which group that you're working with. But the point is you need to contact them and find out what the expectations are, what the requirements are. Use of standards can facilitate the data integration. Again, if everyone in the community followed the same standard, makes it a lot easier to mix and match things. The problem, I don't know, the great thing about standards is there's so many of them. This is sort of a joke in our community, is that there's way too many of them at the moment. So there's a whole collection of data centers and national archives depending on where you are. BICO-DEMO is one of them for US NSF-funded researcher. CDAC is the other one, and Alex Kozier will talk about that tomorrow in greater detail. And that's one that really applies directly to probably everyone in this room. So BICO-DEMO, less than half of you, but CDAC is the place where all of these data are likely to go. In the US, NODC is the permanent archive for research, but there are analogous oceanographic, national oceanographic data centers or the world data centers in other countries on the planet. Very important to get the data into these national data centers at the end. Those are the permanent archives where the data will be preserved forever. And that's the last part. Wow, 3 minutes to go. Thank you. Yes, Heather.
Cindy, can you comment a little bit more on the difference between a data management office and a data archive?
Yeah. So, there's a lot of variability there. Data management office, I think the other phrase that people use is a data assembly center. It's more of an intermediate level. So you have originating researchers, and there are some organizations that have been funded recently to work with investigators at an earlier stage. So a data assembly center or a data management office like BICO-DEMO, the expectation is that we work with the investigators much earlier on in the process. Those data sets are dynamic. They're updated as often as needed, and we work on the quality control with the originating investigator. BICO-DEMO is not a permanent archive. At some point, although it's been fascinating to me, when I started doing this, I thought 5, maybe 10 years, and then we'd decide that data sets were no longer being actively used, and we'd rotate them off into a deeper storage. That hasn't happened yet. The data from the Jagoff's project from the late 80s are, so that was the North Atlantic Basin study. As they were proposing to do more work in the North Atlantic bloom, 2005, 2006, 2008. Suddenly those data sets became very popular. I noticed a huge increase in the NABE data from Jagoff's, and I thought, why is this all of a sudden? And then I've come to find out that they were proposing new research. So we haven't rotated anything off, but it is not a permanent archive, and at some point the funding could go away and the office disappears. And so all of the data that come into my office end up being archived at NODC. That's one of the things that we do. So the investigator is not required to submit the data to NODC and an intermediate data office. One of the things, we make it very clear that having contributed them to BICO-DEMO, we take care of that requirement to put the data at NODC as a final archive. CDAC, is a little bit different, and Alex will talk about that tomorrow. Their mission is a little bit different, and so their work takes on a slightly different philosophy. So the oceanographic data centers are permanent archives. The National Oceanographic Data Centers, the world data centers are. Their funding is different. There's a long-term commitment to those. Data assembly centers, data management offices are more of an intermediate step. Any other questions? Yes, Alex.
I just wanted.
This is Alex Kozier from CDAC.
And I will talk tomorrow about everything what Cindy said. That is true. It's correct. And she's told you everything about on theory, how does it work, metadata, everything. Tomorrow I will present you all practical aspects, what we do at CDAC with data, with metadata, what and our mission, everything. So you would know because it's we dedicated this course to ocean acidification problem, and we have all needed data for ocean acidification research. So you would know where to send data and where to get data. And also, I wanted to add that it's nothing to do with the course. I have a car, and I'm leaving tomorrow at 10 o'clock right after election. So anybody who wants to ride to Logan International Airport, I would definitely give you a ride. Because my flight around 2 o'clock, but I need to be there around 12, so I leave right after election at 10:30 max. So if anybody needs a ride.
Perhaps the most useful thing that was said this morning. Oh. Any other questions?
I have actually a question for you. I think I talked a lot this morning about misuse of data sets by PIs, and I wonder if, it seems, I've used World Ocean Atlas data a lot, and it certainly has its limitations in different like coastal regions and whatnot. I wonder if there is a large problem with PIs misusing these large data files, these global GLODAB and Arena. Is there an effort to educate people on the limitations of these files?
It's topics which I will touch tomorrow.
Okay.
But just a few words about it. That when we worked on GLODAB database for 5 years, group of scientists from US worked on GLODAB, and we wanted to present everything, information, how did we do it in details. So I'll show you tomorrow that we have absolutely thorough description of all methods we use to compile this database. This is synthesis work, which includes many cruises around the world. And so explanation of everything we did with these cruises to compile this big database is in GLODAB. On the GLODAB, we published numeric data package with all information about that. And we have everything online at CDAC about GLODAB. I think when scientists try to use GLODAB data, they would read first. I know that they don't have time, but they need to read information, what exactly includes in GLODAB to use this data. I don't know personally, I don't know cases when it was misused or I don't know, but GLODAB is the most referred database so far in ocean CO2 community.
I've certainly seen cases where Chris Sabine has responded to people that have put forward theories based on data they've found, and they've misunderstood measurements under these conditions. Measurements done in seawater is the most often, misrepresentation of the data. And so I think that's one of the ways that this is counteracted, is that, Chris is very good about noticing these things and responding quickly with an explanation of why. I can understand how you might have thought that. However, measurements of this sort in seawater are different.
I know someone published a paper a few years ago. I've used World Ocean Atlas quite a bit, and a really alarming paper about the number of data points that go into an individual grid. So you can't have complete global coverage, and if someone's doing a really local study or local assessment of something, it's really important to understand.
And GLODAB purpose was not just to present data and synthesize data and correct data. We corrected a lot of data points in order to get everything online. In the same position. but it's also climatology for ocean carbon. So we did climatology for DIC and total alkalinity in Glodok. Now we're going to go farther in the future, like now we do in Carina, it's carbon in Atlantic Ocean. Also we will make climatology for those parameters. And now we just started Pacific Ocean database. Just a few weeks ago I was in Korea on Pisces meeting when we started to do synthesis work on Pacific data. But I'm going to talk about it tomorrow.
So, Heather, when that alarming paper came out, what was the community response?
I think it almost snuck under the wire. I don't think people were.
So I think that's an issue. I mean, these things are going to happen.
I know that the paper was published, but I don't know how much attention was paid with regards to people applying it to their own
Right.
research and thinking about those limitations. It certainly popped up on my radar screen. I used it all the time.
Right. Good to know, sort of in the category of good to know. Yes.
Some disclaimer or something when you share this data that it will not be used for commercial purposes.
So that's part of the data policy for the different centers. There's no international guideline on this. Certainly BICO-DEMO has a statement that says something along the lines of it is expected that these data will be used for educational or scientific purposes. If you intend to make commercial use of this, so through Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution we have legal protection and that there's a process for doing that. As to whether people actually do it or not, I don't know the mechanism for following up on these things. One of the things that I have observed is that this is still a fairly small community. And so as far as people stealing other people's data, when someone gets up at a scientific meeting and puts up total alkalinity measurements from the equatorial Pacific, everybody knows whose data those are because there just aren't that many of them. You know where they came from. And if they don't give proper attribution, at this point anyway, it's a pretty small community still. And so what happens is that they tend to be ostracized. No one wants to work with them. I think there's a lot of self-policing that's going on. So I think that part, I'm not aware of that happening, where people are stealing other people's data and not giving proper credit. As far as the commercial use, I don't know that this has been a problem yet. It certainly will become more of one as we go into people trying to use data to do iron fertilization, climate change mitigation. There's, a lot of people see a lot of potential for money there, and there is real risk for misuse of this information. But this is true of anything. People will run in the wrong direction with something. So it is just up to the community and the people at large to try and keep track of this. And again, I think having the information out there is the only way of counteracting this. I know there was an issue in one of the German vessels was going to go last year, and an outraged public action group got a hold of this and delayed the cruise. They wanted to prevent them from going, saying that they shouldn't be dumping iron in the ocean, and we didn't have the information. And the response from the community was pretty swift and quick and overwhelming, saying it's the only way to know how to deal with this is to do these controlled scientific experiments. The cruise was delayed, but it went. So the community, I think, came forward and did the right thing and said, we understand your concerns. However, this is absolutely the way to do this. So that sort of thing just has to happen more often. People have to be diligent, ever vigilant about this. It's, we're all in this process together. And as we go through the transition, we're just going to have to learn new, better ways, more responsible ways of dealing with these new capabilities.
Shall we break for coffee?
Break time?
Any further questions? You can refer them privately.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cindy. That was great.
Is that what you had in mind?
Great. I think that was. Well, I think it got people.